comes from the book of Mark. I'll be reading from chapter 2, verses 23 to 28, and I'm using the Revised Standard Version for those of you keeping track. Hear the words of Mark. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, what they're doing is unlawful on the Sabbath." And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God, and when Abiathar was high priest, he ate bread in the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he gave some to his companions." Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Here ends our reading. Friends, from the beginning of time, God created. And then he gave us models and examples of how to live out being a part of his creation. The Sabbath, which is in the Greek form, Sabbaton, and in the Hebrew language, you might be a little more familiar with the term Shabbat. Both terms meaning one thing: rest. In our text that I read this morning, Jesus' point, I believe, is that whenever blind authoritarianism confronts common sense, use common sense. This morning should provide us with a proper perspective on rest. Now, Jesus' directions were not easy for the disciples. These guys were practicing Jews. So it was not easy for them to stop and walk in the field and pluck some grain for them to have a meal. They knew the Jewish law. But Jesus knew that the Jewish law had been expanded on those two great commandments and expanded to 612 regulations, which became a spider's web of constraints that stunted their spirits. So Jewish law set out an extremist example, and Jesus recalibrated that with a practical perspective. He said this: "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." Aha, a little perspective this morning, eh? Don't neglect Sabbath rest, but don't starve to death in order to observe it. I imagine the disciples sat together after that day and they ate a meal. And they probably had some good conversation that day as well, doing a little manual labor for their food. How many of you remember a time, this excludes anybody under the age of 40, How many of you can remember a time when the grocery stores were closed on Sunday morning? Oh yeah, everybody's ready to roll. Most gas stations, I had to think about that. It's like, there was not a gas station on every corner open. There was only a select few that I can remember in my faint memory as a one-year-old child. Yeah, remember that? Remember, there were certainly no big box stores. There weren't any such thing as a big box. There was Montgomery Ward. What was the other one? Federal Department Store. Ooh, yeah. All right, I better stop now because I'm joining y'all with the aging thing here. All right. But do you remember that? If you were a churchgoer, it was church, home, and Sunday dinner. A full dinner. Roast beef, you could smell it when you walked back in the door from church, or fried chicken. Annie's now laughing. It must have been fried chicken in your house, Annie. Okay. Yeah, full meals. And a lot of the time, it was kind of the family thing that, if it was your turn, or maybe you were stuck with it every Sunday because you were the best cook in the family, right? The relatives or your good friends congregated. It was just a thing that you did. And all of a sudden, there was 8 to 10 people or 17 people, or depending on what your family group and friend group was, people came, and what happened? The women went into the kitchen and helped with, can I mash the potatoes and whatever. And before you knew it, you were sitting at the table, and you were having a meal and fellowship with each other. Wow. Or sometimes, and I can remember this, it was just the immediate family. Maybe just the 3 of you. And we would hurry up, kind of, and eat. And then my dad would say this, let's go and see what we can see. As a little peanut, I can remember that was just my cue to say, it's going to be glorious whatever it is. And we never knew what it was. But he, after working at General Motors in a white-collar position for 42 years with starched white collars, anybody remember that? Probably you guys remember the feel. I would remember that he would come home after work during the week, and there would be a little red ring around his neck because the starch was so, but that's just what you did. And so on Sunday morning, even though my dad was not a believer, he would wait till we finished the meal and say, let's go see what we can see. And we would jump in the car and he would drive. And we would find ourselves not in the heart of Northwest Detroit where our house was, but we would find ourselves in the country, Northville. I was waiting for that, yeah. And it would be the most amazing Sunday afternoon. And that was my dad's rest. I suggest that today we desperately need a pause button. Not just any pause button, but a spiritually charged, heart-opening space in our lives. A space that is set apart from our regular daily grind. We need some sacred time. Time outside the cycle of work, of school demands, and consumerism. Gang, we just need time together. Yesterday, if you were with us, our sanctuary was filled almost to the brim with people who were here to honor Kay Leisher. And there was a sacred space created here in this place. And people intuitively knew it. And it was warm, and it was comforting, and it was funny, and there was laughter. And out in the meal space where there was 100 of us crammed a little close together, eating food prepared, I heard over and over and over again, boy, it was so good to see so-and-so again. It was so good just to eat some good food and talk with each other and catch up. I suggest to you, my friends, it wasn't a rowdy space. It was a sacred space of joy. We need time. We need time to be with good friends. We need time to dream. I wonder, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, how many of us last week took some Sabbath time, yes, no matter how old or young you are, to dream about the future in your own life. How many of you have taken time to just sit and think last week, let alone pray? How about meditate? Or play? Yes, play is God ordained, whether you are 16, 66, or 106. God ordained that you should be able to Sabbath rest and play. And He saw it was good, and so it was. And where exactly, Pastor, is this non-work time supposed to come from? We are so involved in dealing with our stuff that 7 days a week doesn't even cut it. How many times have you heard lately, I sure wish there were more than 24 hours in a day? Hello? Are you kidding me? I dare you, say that to God. Now, don't get me wrong, a fast pace in your life, chief of sinners though I be, can be exhilarating. That's why I love it. It can make us feel successful. It can carve out a feeling of, yes, I am doing the work of God, and I love it. And I do. But if we don't carve out Sabbath space intentionally in our lives, everybody, you too, Jack, don't think that high school kids don't have stress, right, Jay Cotts? They lived with it for years and they're still enduring that. Anybody else who has been through raising a high school student knows that they aren't playing. They aren't playing. They are working and they have their own stresses that they probably aren't going to go blah. Particularly a guy thing, right, dude? Yeah, okay. Just saying. If you don't carve out some of that time for yourself, okay, day after day, year after year, you may reach the end of your journey here and you will have a sinking feeling that you have missed some of the most important times of your life. Sabbath rest does its best to create what I call a somewhere else. And like those car rides on Sunday, they help you set apart and look at your world with new eyes. Anybody who has ever changed your scenery, snowbirds, I bet you can speak to this, right? And not just you, but any one of us who has done an activity and seen it through to completion. Isn't this what Taos Bay Players does? You put up a play, you work day and night, and when it gets the production, you are exhilarated, and then it ends. And what happens? I hope we all go, Whew. It's done. And then you can look back on that experience, whatever that is. Your time in Arizona, your time in California, your time in Florida, away. And when you come back to another place, hopefully a sacred place, you look at that experience with new eyes. That is the blessing of Sabbath rest. You can understand differently. You can look at your own life and your own work and your own job, whatever that is, with a little better understanding. And you know what else? I think you realize, at least in my experience, when I can step back, whew, you know, I'm okay just the way I am. That's Sabbath rest. Now, that said, keeping Sabbath is hard, especially if those around you come from a work ethic of you got to work until you get it done, and then you move on to the next project. It can be very hard for you to live in a culture that says, I just can't stand still. I've just got to be busy. I've just got to do something. That's not me, but I am surrounded at times by that. So what does that do to the person who is trying to strive to honor God by keeping Sabbath rest? You can be viewed as a slacker. You can be viewed as weak. It takes courage, my friends, to rest. It takes strength to resist those tasks that continually nip at your heels while you are resting. Anybody? I'm going to not answer my cell phone. I am going to look at the lake. I am going to try to create a piece of art. I am going to try to read a book, which I've had since last year at this time. And so you are convicted, and you sit and you begin to rest in the Sabbath. But what are you going to do? You forgot to sign this invoice. What are you going to do? What happened? You didn't prepare this. How, you know, the next Sunday is coming up. You haven't even started your research yet. Blah, blah. Isn't it hard? Use your own words. Fill in your own blank. And by the time all of those little tasks that you think you can accomplish and then rest, never happens. I can tell you, it never happens. So you learn to suck up the resting part because you don't want to be viewed as a slacker, and you try to mush forward in the great hope that God will grant you that rest. Newsflash, He already did. There's the hard part, my friends. He already granted you the Sabbath rest. In Genesis, when He said, and on the seventh day, God looked and He rested. Now, it doesn't say, just the news flash here, it doesn't say it's Sunday because the Sabbath was observed on Saturday. He didn't name a time to do that. He said He worked for 6 days and He rested for 1. Now, before those of you who are type A personalities break out in a cold sweat, let me share this. 24 hours of Sabbathing can be really hard if you have never practiced it. And so I suggest to you today, don't set the bar quite so high. Take a half of a Sabbath rest. And maybe it's on Wednesday. And unplug, turn off the television, turn off any social media, turn off the neighbor in the yard next to you who wants some help mowing his lawn. Turn it all off and honor God. There it is. By taking the bold step, just like the disciples did in our story this morning. They went ahead into that field and they plucked that grain so that they could sit together and enjoy a meal. And you know what? For some of them, that probably wasn't work at all. It was part of the Sabbath experience. But don't run to cram 28 hours of things and stuff into a day when you need to understand your life better. You see, God did nothing but give you tools to use to realize you will never learn more about life on earth. You will never learn how to cope with all of the ups and downs in this life unless you do what he told you in Genesis, which is remember, keep holy the Lord's day, whatever day that is, and step back and rest your mind and your heart and your body and your spirit and just be. And if you can do that, I guarantee you that your God will bust into your soul and your heart, and he will give you the spirit of peace. Anybody here desperately seeking peace in their lives? It can happen. You got to give up. You have to give up running your life and rest in God. And then you will experience the peace that passes all understanding. Amen.